They said Eleanor Whitmore was forgetting things. It started subtly: missed appointments, repeated questions, a pause too long before recalling a familiar name. Doctors called it early cognitive impairment. Her family called it the beginning of the end. Eleanor called it useful. At 78, Eleanor Whitmore had built an empire from patience and precision. Hotels, vineyards, philanthropic trusts, every asset carefully layered over 5 decades. She had survived recessions, betrayals, and the quiet war of boardrooms where smiles hid knives. She knew one thing better than most: people reveal their true nature when they believe you are no longer watching. Now, seated in the velvet chair of her private suite at the Whitmore Grand Hotel, Eleanor listened while her children spoke about her, not to her. "Mother, it's just paperwork," her eldest son, Richard, said gently, too gently. "We're worried. These memory lapses, what if something happens?" Her daughter Margaret nodded, lips pressed into practiced concern. "This is for your protection. A temporary transfer. Just until things stabilize." Eleanor stared at the window, at the city she had helped shape. She let her eyes glaze slightly. Let her hands tremble. What are we signing again?" she asked softly. They exchanged a look, quick, sharp, triumphant. Margaret slid the documents closer. "Just power of attorney. Estate management. So you don't have to worry anymore. So I don't have to exist anymore," Eleanor thought. She nodded slowly. "I'm tired," she murmured. "So very tired." They smiled. That night, after they left, Eleanor did not sleep. She reviewed every word spoken, every pause, every breath. She knew the tone of genuine fear. This was not it. This was anticipation. The next afternoon, she went downstairs alone. The Whitmore Grand was hosting a charity gala that evening. The lobby buzzed with rehearsals, florists, staff moving like clockwork. At the concierge desk stood Daniel, a young man with observant eyes and a habit of noticing what others ignored. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, startled. "Are you feeling well?" Eleanor leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Daniel, do you know how to access the hotel's internal security playback?" He hesitated. "Yes, ma'am, but..." "Please," she said. "I need to see something. And I need you to be very discreet." Minutes later, in a quiet monitoring room, Daniel hesitated with his hand on the controls. "What I'm about to show you, it involves your family," he said carefully. "I wasn't sure, but..." "Show me," Eleanor replied. The screen flickered to life. It showed a private conference room upstairs. Her grandchildren, young, confident, well-dressed, stood in a loose circle. One cleared his throat and began reading aloud. "We gather today to honor the life of Eleanor Whitmore." They laughed. Another interrupted. No, less emotion. "Investors don't like crying. Don't forget to thank the board," a third added. "They'll be watching." Eleanor felt no shock, only clarity. So this was how they mourned her, in advance. She straightened slowly, her eyes sharpening like glass catching light. "Thank you, Daniel," she said calmly. "Please forget you ever showed me this." As she walked back toward the elevators, her steps were steady. They believed she was fading. So she would fade, exactly as they expected. And while they rehearsed her ending, Eleanor Whitmore would begin her final test. From that day forward, Eleanor Whitmore became exactly who they believed she was becoming. She forgot names she had spoken for decades. She misplaced jewelry that had once been catalogued in her mind like inventory. She asked the same question twice at dinner, then 3 times, then laughed apologetically at herself. Her family watched closely, and they relaxed. Richard took over meetings. Margaret began, organizing, Eleanor's study. The grandchildren visited more often now, always together, always helpful, always smiling too brightly. "Grandmother," one of them said one afternoon, "do you remember the vineyard in Provence?" Eleanor frowned, squinting as if the word itself were unfamiliar. Provence. They exchanged glances again. That look, the one Eleanor now recognized perfectly. The look that said it's working. What they didn't notice was what Eleanor never forgot. She remembered the cadence of their lies. She remembered who touched which papers. She remembered which drawer Margaret opened when she thought no one was looking. Each night, alone, Eleanor recorded everything. Not on a computer, too obvious, but in a leather-bound notebook hidden behind the false panel of a bookcase she had designed herself decades earlier. Names, dates, behaviors, patterns. Meanwhile, her decline accelerated, at least in public. At a board luncheon, she spilled water on the tablecloth and stared at it as if puzzled by gravity itself. At a charity appearance, she forgot the name of the foundation that bore her own surname. Sympathy turned into certainty. She shouldn't be making decisions anymore, Margaret whispered to a lawyer in the hallway, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. Eleanor blinked slowly, letting her shoulders sag. That night, she requested a family meeting. They gathered in her suite, concern carefully arranged on their faces. Eleanor sat wrapped in a shawl, smaller now, fragile. I don't think I can manage things, she said, her voice trembling. The money, the properties, it's all so much. Richard reached for her hand, almost unable to hide his relief. That's why we're here, Mother. She nodded. I want to update my will. The room went still. Hope is a dangerous thing, it makes people careless. I want to make sure everything is fair, Eleanor continued. But I don't trust myself anymore. So I've decided on something simple. They leaned in. I'll place the estate into a temporary trust, she said slowly. 1 year. At the end of that year, whoever proves they can be trusted, will inherit. Margaret frowned. Trusted how? Eleanor looked up, eyes clouded, voice soft. By behavior. By care. By honesty. They smiled politely. They believed this was the rambling idea of a woman losing her grip. But Eleanor had already written the terms. The trust would not measure affection. It would not reward closeness. It would observe. That night, Eleanor added a new heading to her notebook. The test. And beneath it, one sentence. Give people enough rope, and they will show you exactly who they are. The trust changed everything. What had once been quiet manipulation became open performance. Suddenly, everyone was devoted. Every visit was documented, every gesture exaggerated, every act of kindness carefully staged. Flowers arrived daily. So did handwritten notes. Dinners were organized, just for Mother, though Eleanor often noticed the seating was arranged to allow whispered conversations at the far end of the table. They were no longer a family. They were contestants. Richard began managing the hotels with theatrical responsibility, announcing every decision loudly, making sure Eleanor was within earshot. Margaret volunteered to oversee Eleanor's medications, insisting on full control, citing medical safety. The grandchildren took turns visiting, each one eager to be seen as indispensable. But greed has a flaw. It cannot sustain sincerity. Eleanor watched as patience wore thin. Smiles cracked. Voices sharpened when they thought she couldn't hear. Doors closed too quickly. Arguments erupted in hallways and were silenced when she entered the room. One evening, Eleanor sat quietly in the lounge while two grandchildren argued behind the glass partition. She doesn't even know who you are half the time, one snapped. Still, the other replied, she knows who signs the papers. Eleanor closed her eyes, not in pain, but in confirmation. The trust's terms were precise. Every interaction with Eleanor was logged. Medical adjustments required dual authorization. Financial decisions left digital fingerprints. What they didn't know was who was watching. Daniel, the concierge, had been promoted quietly to personal liaison. Officially, he assisted Eleanor with daily logistics. Unofficially, he documented everything she asked him to. Dates of missed visits, changes in tone, who raised their voice, who rushed her meals, who spoke about her as if she were already gone. One afternoon, Margaret arrived furious. I can't do this anymore, she hissed to Richard outside Eleanor's suite. She's declining faster. We should accelerate the process. Richard hesitated. Careful. She won't know, Margaret snapped. She barely knows us. Inside, Eleanor sat very still. That night, she wrote a second list in her notebook. Disqualified. One by one, names were added, not for cruelty, but for truth. The test was never about who loved her most. It was about who respected her least when power was within reach. As the months passed, alliances formed and collapsed. Secrets leaked. Kindness became transactional. And Eleanor, silent, observant, underestimated, allowed it all. Because the more they believed she was fading, the brighter their true selves burned. And fire, Eleanor knew, leaves nothing hidden. Winter had arrived, and the estate was wrapped in a quiet frost. Eleanor's once bustling home now hummed with careful, calculated activity, every visit from her children and grandchildren choreographed, every gesture under scrutiny. She watched from her favorite armchair, sipping tea she had brewed herself, her eyes following every movement. It was during one of these, routine visits, that the first irreversible mistake occurred. Margaret, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, had grown increasingly impatient. The delays, the careful observation, and Eleanor's deliberate weakness had begun to gnaw at her. She had convinced herself that Eleanor's mind was failing, that she could push harder, faster, and no one would stop her. That afternoon, she arrived with a package, insisting on organizing Eleanor's personal papers herself. "Mother," she said, voice sweet but sharp, "I'm just trying to make things easier for you. Let me handle it." Eleanor, pretending frailty, leaned back and gave the softest sigh. Her hands trembled slightly, and her voice wavered. Margaret's eyes lit up. Victory was close, so close. But what Margaret didn't see was Daniel, the concierge, quietly recording everything. Every whispered order, every subtle attempt at coercion, every gleam of impatience was captured. Margaret rifled through the desk drawers, pulling out papers, threatening to shred, useless clutter, dismissing Eleanor's protests. She held up one folder, labeled wills and amendments, and laughed under her breath. "Finally, we can finish this. She'll never know what I've done." It was the moment Eleanor had been waiting for. She rose slowly, her frail mask slipping just enough to reveal the sharp steel beneath. Her voice, though soft, carried an unmistakable authority. "Margaret," she said, calm but icy, "please step away from my papers." Margaret froze, a hint of panic creeping into her eyes. Eleanor continued, her words deliberate. "You've made your choice. You've proven what kind of person you are when no one is watching. Everything you've done today has been noted, recorded, catalogued, and it will be reflected in your share of the estate." Margaret's laughter faltered. "You can't." "You already did," Eleanor interrupted. "And Daniel has the evidence. Every step, every misstep, every attempt to manipulate me." Margaret's face went pale. She stumbled back, realizing she had overstepped. What Eleanor had feared, or rather, what Eleanor had been testing, was the moment someone revealed themselves completely. Margaret had done just that. She had exposed her greed, her impatience, her willingness to disrespect her own mother-in-law for the sake of inheritance. Eleanor returned to her chair, as composed as ever. She poured herself another cup of tea, the calmness of her actions masking the storm brewing inside. This wasn't punishment yet. Not really. It was a warning. Because in the inheritance test, every action had a consequence. And some consequences could not be undone. She made a mental note. Friday's final gathering will be more than a signature. It will be a reckoning. The first irreversible mistake had been made. The others had no idea it was coming, and Eleanor would ensure they revealed themselves one by one. The stage was set. The final act was near. Friday arrived with the hush of anticipation. The estate felt almost sacred, each corridor, each chandelier, each polished surface reflecting the careful calm of a house that knew secrets. Eleanor moved with purpose, her wine-colored velvet shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders, her cane only for show. Every eye would see the frailty she projected, but no one would see the mind behind it. Her children and grandchildren arrived promptly, unaware that today would not be the casual signing they expected. Margaret and the others were already whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward Eleanor's study, convinced she was too weak, too old, too distracted to notice anything. "Mother, are you feeling well?" her son Jonathan asked, with that polite condescension Eleanor had grown to recognize. "We wouldn't want to pressure you." Eleanor smiled faintly, her hands folded like fragile porcelain. "Of course, darling. But let's get this over with, shall we?" The boardroom had been prepared meticulously. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier. On it lay the documents, pens poised, and, in the center, Eleanor had placed a small but unusual arrangement, 6 identical envelopes, each with a gold seal. My dear family, she began, her voice quiet but firm, carrying effortlessly to the far corners of the room. Before we proceed, there is one final tradition I must observe, the final test of Sterling House. Confused glances were exchanged. Eleanor gestured to the envelopes. Each of you will receive one. Inside is a question only you can answer, about the legacy of this estate, about the values it was built upon, and about the care of what you wish to inherit. Choose wisely, for your answer will determine the share you receive. Her son, Marcus, smirked. Mom, this is unnecessary. Just sign, we all know you're of sound mind. Ah, but that is exactly what this test measures, Eleanor replied. Your impatience, your greed, your readiness to take what isn't earned. She handed the envelopes personally. Each family member opened their envelope. Inside, written in elegant calligraphy, was a single question. If you inherit the estate tomorrow, how will you preserve the essence of what was built here? Not the buildings, not the money, but the soul, the integrity, the legacy of Sterling House. Silence fell. Marcus's eyes flickered nervously. Margaret's lips pursed. Jonathan shuffled papers. They had been so sure that Eleanor's weakness would allow them to take everything without scrutiny. Now, the truth of their greed was being exposed in a question they could not fake. Eleanor continued, her gaze sharp. You have 5 minutes to answer. Write honestly. The answers will be read aloud, and they will become part of the record. This is no ordinary will. I have embedded my judgment within the distribution itself. Those who reveal only selfishness will find their inheritance redirected. Marcus's hand shook. He was accustomed to control, to bending others to his will. But this test wasn't about contracts, lawyers, or signatures, it was about character. And character, Eleanor knew, could not be feigned under scrutiny. As the minutes ticked by, the family scribbled furiously, their faces betraying panic, desperation, and, in some cases, shame. Eleanor watched quietly, a predator in plain sight, noting the subtle twitches, the hesitation, the fleeting glances at each other. Each reaction revealed more than words ever could. And as the final bell of the clock echoed through the room, Eleanor smiled faintly. She had learned everything she needed to know. The final test was complete. Those who had thought her weak were about to realize that weakness can be the most dangerous weapon of all. The room was tense, thick with unease, as Eleanor collected the envelopes. Her hands, steady and deliberate, moved with the grace of someone who had always been in command, even when pretending otherwise. She didn't need to read the answers aloud immediately, she already knew what each one would reveal. Years of observation, of subtle testing, had taught her everything about her family's character. Let us begin, Eleanor said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. The answers will now be read aloud. The estate of Sterling House is more than land, buildings, and money. It is the legacy of compassion, honor, and integrity. It is time to see who truly understands that. She started with Margaret. The granddaughter's answer was verbose, filled with mentions of charity and preservation, but Eleanor noted the lack of sincerity. Phrases felt rehearsed, polished like the speeches she had caught them practicing in the hotel footage. Next was Jonathan, who wrote about expanding the business and maximizing profits, leaving out the values that had guided the family for generations. Eleanor's lips curled in a knowing smile. Marcus's paper was a disaster in honesty. He spoke only of ownership and control, betraying impatience and greed in almost every line. Eleanor's mind traced back to every impatient glance, every snide remark. They had revealed themselves fully. Finally, she reached the youngest, her quietest grandchild, Emily. Unlike the others, Emily's words were heartfelt. She wrote about community, about care for those who had been loyal to Sterling House for decades, about preserving the values that made the estate more than just wealth. Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction. This one had the heart Sterling House deserved. Eleanor stood and addressed the room. You all failed to grasp the essence of what this estate represents. You thought my weakness would be your gain. You were mistaken. Greed, impatience, and self-interest have been recorded, and the terms of my will are clear. Those who reveal selfishness will not inherit what they thought was theirs. And the one who shows true understanding, she held Emily's paper aloft, will receive the legacy of Sterling House in full. Shock, disbelief, and panic washed over the others. Marcus stammered. Margaret's face paled. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. Mother, you can't. I can, Eleanor interrupted, her tone absolute. I have always been able. You see, the will was not only legal but pre-planned. The final test, the envelopes, the observation, it was all part of the design. Sterling House will continue, but only in the hands of someone worthy. Not someone who sees it as a stepping stone for personal gain. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Playing weak, pretending forgetfulness, feigned indecision, that was my strategy. You saw a grandmother. I saw your true selves. And now, justice is served. Emily's eyes glistened with tears, a mixture of gratitude and awe. She had never anticipated such responsibility, yet she understood the honor. Eleanor approached her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Take care, my dear. Sterling House is more than an inheritance, it is a promise to do what is right. You have earned it not by force, but by heart. The room fell silent, the others speechless, confronted with the consequences of their own greed. Eleanor returned to her chair, her facade of frailty intact for anyone who might still doubt her. She had exposed the selfishness hidden behind smiles, silenced the pretenders, and ensured the estate's legacy would continue where it truly belonged. In the end, the lesson was clear: strength does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, and watches quietly, revealing the truth about those around you. The inheritance test was complete, and Eleanor had won, not with wealth, but with wisdom.